Welcome. I'm Aryeh Green, and I'm delighted to be back having a conversation with all my friends at Smith Ranch, and really excited to talk about the topic that we have on the schedule for today. In fact, this is the first of a series. I'll do another one in a few weeks, which will be connected. And in fact, maybe that's the first place to start. I'm really delighted to have been asked to speak about a topic which is really near and dear to my heart, both as an individual, as a business person, and as an Israeli, and as a Jew. And you'll immediately understand both where I'm coming from when I say that and why I'm wearing the shirt that I'm wearing, as I explain. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about renewable energy in Africa, and a introduction or teaser to the topic for the next and related conversation, which is about Israel's relationship with Africa, historically, socially, economically, politically, religiously, and culturally, from every other standpoint. Well, I'm wearing today a little bit of an unusual apparel, a shirt. Most of you who know me, and we've had a number of these discussions, usually see me in a button-down shirt. I would say more professional, but that's really not true. It's a cultural issue of what we consider to be informal or formal or professional. This is actually a shirt that I purchased in Rwanda from a very special institution called the Agozo Shalom Youth Village, which we'll have opportunity to speak about later as we talk about renewable energy in Africa. And that's our topic now for today's discussion. Most of you know, or many of you know, if you've heard me speak before, that I've been working for the last 5 years, well, formally for 5 years, but in fact for over a decade, in helping a small and yet very important company called Gigawatt Global to bring renewable energy to a number of African countries. And today we're going to talk about both the prospect of bringing renewable energy to Africa, why it's important, how it's possible, why and how a group of Israelis, Israeli Jews, Muslims, Christians, atheists, Arabs, and others have joined forces to bring renewable energy to Africa. Well, in fact, our story starts not in Africa, but naturally in Israel. Most of you know that I've lived in Israel for 35 years, and many of you may know that Israel has a long history of relationships with both African nations and with other developing nations around the world. But that will really be the subject of our next discussion. What I want to share with you now as an introduction is the brief story of a young man named Yosef Abramowitz. He's a very good friend of mine, and if you've read my book, or my Israel Trail, the name of the book that many of you know that I wrote a few years ago about my hike on the Israel National Trail and meeting personal challenges. Many of you who've either heard me speak about that experience or who read my book know that Yosef is an old friend of mine. And he actually started the solar industry in the state of Israel. He brought grid scale, meaning commercial scale, utility scale solar fields to Israel for the first time. And he, as an entrepreneur, as really the initiator of that field in Israel, learned many lessons, and with his team in what was called the Aryeh Power Company, built 12 solar fields across the south of Israel, which in fact today provide 100% of the region's electricity during the day. That's actually relatively recent news. Just as of March of this year, that milestone was achieved. And it's something which is actually achievable. It's a lesson to be learned for all of us in the Western world. Spain, Italy, certainly the United States of America, we have enough sun to power our entire countries if we simply set our mind to do it. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit because we'll talk soon about the economic and social and business issues involved in renewable energy in general, solar, wind, hydro, and others, and the difference between American and other Western nations and Africa and other developing nations when it comes to bringing renewable energy to to these countries. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because I started to talk about why I'm wearing this shirt. And kind of just as a fun change of pace and to accentuate or to accent and to kind of make the point that that's what we're talking about today, I bought this shirt in a small youth village in Rwanda, which is where our company, Gigawatt Global, built our first solar field. And so to set the stage with that, I wanted to wear this for fun, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but also I'm going to share my screen, as it's called, with the recording we're doing, so that you can have a little bit more of a visual impression and experience as we talk about these issues about bringing renewable energy to Africa, because there's enough numbers and graphs and information I want to share with you that I thought it might be both more interesting rather than just looking at me the whole time, and also more informative. And I also wanted to make sure that you really got into the mood, as it were, the feel of what it means to bring renewable energy to Africa. So I'm going to go through a few of these slides. I will occasionally turn the slides off so that you can see me a little bit more up front. I hope that you can see me either on the side of your screen or at the top. You can choose, I know this is going to be recorded, so in fact, hopefully you'll see me in some way there to the side as I'm talking. So we're going to talk about a solar revolution. We're going to talk about renewable energy in Africa, and we're going to do so from a few different standpoints. And one of them, I'll take a few minutes just to introduce you to our company, because the company and the work that we do and the approach that we take is very relevant for the wider issue of how renewable energy can be so beneficial to the people of Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as other developing nations around the world. One element of an understanding of the challenge that we face and the opportunity as a business is that the renewable energy sector is really taking the lion's share of the future development of new electricity generation, new energy generation projects across these regions of developing countries, whether it's wind or hydro or solar, as you can see from our field here, which is the field actually in Rwanda, our first field in Africa. It's a real opportunity, and we as a company are exploiting that opportunity in order to create a platform to focus on the most needy people, the most underdeveloped and needy nations, where we can bring to them renewable energy within the context of a strong, powerful business model. And as I said, a lot of that energy is coming from the developing world, and there's a reason for that. These developing countries need to create for themselves a certain energy independence, and that's one of the things that's driving this growth. Now, one of the other things that it's worth sharing with you as we begin the discussion of Africa in particular is that 7 of the 11 fastest growing economies in the world are in Sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, it's a region of tremendous economic opportunity and growth, and also challenge. So I'm not going to go into details about the company itself, but what I do want you to understand is that we have a real vision of empowering the poorest nations in the world and their people, empowering them literally and figuratively with a sustainable model of power production, enabling them to be energy independent. And that's very important when you think about the dependency that many of these nations have on the Gulf states, for instance. If they're not, Nigeria is an oil producing nation. The rest of Africa is not. Most of Asia and most of South American developing nations are not oil producers or coal producers or natural gas producers. And that means that they're dependent on the whims or political pressures or economic pressures of the oil producers in the world, which is not conducive to them making energy decisions which suit their own national requirements. And the last thing I want to say about our company is that though we're not a philanthropy, we're not a charitable endeavor, our bottom line is to bring a a reasonable, and in fact, relatively, as we say, robust return, a really successful return on their investment to our investors. But we actually have a quadruple bottom line. As important to us as providing a decent return to our investors is to promote the economic and social development of the companies that we're working, of the countries that we're working in. Obviously, as a renewable energy company, we are concerned with the climate goals that the world shares in terms of climate change, the environmental impact of dirty diesel and oil and other coal and other energy producing fuels, and the humanitarian goals, which are just as important to us, to promote the social and economic benefits and welfare for the communities that we work in and for the wider nation. Because energy itself, and that I think is really the pivotal point of this discussion, energy itself is not just about electricity. People think about electricity when we're in the West, and we think about charging our cell phones or running an air conditioner. But when you're talking about an agrarian economy, really a subsistence economy, energy provides some of the basics for life, whether it's food security and the production of food, whether it's health issues. And if you can imagine not having electricity to power a refrigerator, to store medicines in, let alone for an operating theater to carry out life-saving operations. Education, to have a light bulb in a classroom, in a hut, in the middle of an African village takes electricity. And obviously economic development relies on the provision of energy, of electricity, from whatever source. And what we're going to talk about today is how the idea of utility scale solar or wind or hydro electricity, renewable energy, can positively impact the local communities of these developing countries. So if we want to get started, one of the things to do is to recognize the challenges that are faced today by these countries in Africa who get their electricity from a number of different sources. Primarily on the right of this graph, you can see that oil, coal, and natural gas provide the bulk, provide a good 50% of electricity production in Sub-Saharan Africa. But I want to actually make the point that in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's even more. And there we're talking about the energy produced for the national grid, or sometimes for smaller installations for industrial parks, or even individual cities or villages or shops. But here's the rub. You look at the left half, you look at the biofuels and waste. Here what we're talking about when we talk about energy is not electricity to provide power to a factory or even a hospital or a clinic or a school. Here we're talking about the burning of waste matter, for instance, for food fuel, to burn a small fire to cook on. Now, there are two issues that are important here. One is how environmentally damaging that can be, both in terms of the collection of and the use of wood from forests or manure or what have you, but also the health hazards. By burning these kind of fuels, many African families cook inside their hut with no ventilation. And so the health hazards to the children, to the women, and to the whole community are tremendous, and it can be also very expensive. Now, going back to the right half of the graph, these fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, and others, are incredibly expensive in Africa. It's a little bit hard for us to understand as Americans or Westerners, and especially America, which is an oil-producing nation where oil, gas, and coal is ubiquitously available. So we don't think of them as necessarily pricey commodities. They are just that. They're a commodity. They're produced locally, and they're distributed relatively efficiently across the United States. Imagine in Africa, just as one example, the field that we're building in Burundi, that Gigawatt Global is building in Burundi, is about an 8-hour Jeep ride over bumpy dirt roads from the capital of Bujumbura. Bujumbura itself, I use the term capital relatively loosely. It's itself a small town with dirt roads and not a lot of electricity production even for it, or use for it. Also, Burundi is one of the 2 or 3 poorest countries on the planet, and we'll get to that in a second as we talk about comparative understanding of electricity use. The point that I'm making is that the expensive distribution of oil, coal, and other fuels for energy production is phenomenal. There's no infrastructure of roads like there is across America or Western Europe or what have you, in order to deliver, even if one could afford the actual price of oil or coal or the like. So one of the things that's important to recognize is that solar and other renewables like wind and hydro, but particularly solar, is in fact competitive economically in the countries that we're talking about in Africa. I just want to expand on that slightly, which is why I turned the slide off for a minute. Here in America, we and the rest of, say, Western Europe, the Western world, we take it as axiomatic that we have to subsidize renewable energy. California, a number of other states, Oregon, others in America, have set goals for the use of renewable energy from an ideological standpoint. We in the West see it as helpful and important, or even imperative, to combat global warming and to combat climate change, to move to renewable energy resources, which of course is commendable and correct. But in developing countries, the fact is that the renewable energy possibilities are economically not just feasible, but attractive in ways that we don't really, because of our access and the distribution networks, that we don't really appreciate in the West. You don't need a subsidy to make renewable energy, and particularly solar, economically attractive and beneficial and more advantageous in Africa like you do in America. So we're looking at a situation where the possibility of providing electricity to Africa is becoming more attractive from a business standpoint. But if you look at these numbers that I have in front of you now, it paints an incredibly illustrative picture of the kind of gaps and disparities between the wealthier nations, which are oil-producing nations, predominantly in North Africa, and then South Africa as well, in terms of that one Western economy, which drives the country of South Africa, which drives a lot of the economic activity in its surrounding area there in Southern Africa. If you compare those numbers on the right of your screen, the top and the bottom, 1,500 kilowatt hours per capita, per person per year, and at the bottom of the screen, 2,000 of those. And you compare that to the figures in the middle, 188, 90, 167. 90 is under, that's under 100 kilowatt hours per person in East Africa, and not a heck of a lot more being provided in West Africa, etc. That's the region that we call Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these numbers may not mean a lot. First of all, you can see the comparative issues of literally 1/10 of the energy consumption per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa as compared to North and South Africa. But let's go one step further. I once asked Hannah, our PhD in solar energy, our chief engineer and the head of our project management team at Gigawatt Global, for a little bit of a more personal understanding of what exactly we mean when we talk about, for instance, Burundi as one of the poorest nations in the world. And she provided me with the following figures. Burundi, by the way, and it's important for this example, has about 10 million people in it, which is roughly about what we have in Israel, which of course is a developed nation, part of the Western world. In the same population of about 10 million people, Israel uses in 1/2 an hour the amount of electricity used by Burundi in an entire year. Meaning the people of Burundi use in an entire year as much electricity as Israel uses in 1/2 an hour. Now, I could compare that to the San Francisco Bay Area as an example. I don't have the exact figures, but it would be roughly the same. You're talking about a fraction of the electricity use that we're used to. And that's why I make the comparison between charging your cell phone or running your air conditioner and having a basic light bulb in a classroom or a refrigerator to refrigerate medicines, let alone for economic activity in terms of businesses, factories, or the like. What that says on the one hand is, well, it demonstrates the real poverty in these countries, but it also provides tremendous opportunity. Because if that's the case, and this is a different way of looking at it, if you compare, for instance, Sub-Saharan Africa with less than 100 kilowatt hours of electricity consumption per capita with the United States, which is 13,000 kilowatt hours per capita, you see another example of, or another way of looking at these disparities. If that's true, then that means that if we can add to the electricity generating capacity of a country like Burundi, and we have an economic model to do so, that's where we're building now at Gigawatt Global, and we're working, you'll see later, in another dozen countries across Africa. It means that the impact, even of a small field, can be tremendous. The first field that we built in Rwanda, which I'll describe shortly, is providing today, already, in the past 6 years, over 5% of that country's electricity capacity. And Rwanda is a relatively stable economy and a relatively advanced economy within the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. Burundi, a similar size field that we're building in Burundi today, is going to be providing, once it's finished being built by the end of this year, 15% of the country's electricity needs, meaning we are going to make a tremendous impact. And how is that impact measured? If you think about something called the Human Development Index, which is made up of health services, which then lead to issues of life expectancy figures, education issues in terms of how many years students remain in school, which is also a function of the economic development and the need, or hopefully lack of a need, for small children to drop out of school to help in the subsistence farming or other issues to support their families, and the issues, economic issues of gross national income. What you can see from this chart is that a little bit of addition of electricity capacity per capita creates an incredibly steep curve of the provision of human development needs. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about those other three bottom lines, to bringing renewable energy to Africa and to other developing nations. Now, why Africa? I'll give you a few good reasons, one of which is that if you look at this map, you can see that Africa could power the entire world if we could find a way to capture, with the renewable energy, the sun in particular, to capture that electricity and then transmit it to other nations. Now, we're actually doing that in Africa, between some of the areas in Africa, something called, for instance, the East Africa Economic Community, which is looking for a shared power infrastructure. But what I want to focus, though, is not just the abundance of sunlight in Africa that you can see here, but also the importance of the energy independence that I mentioned earlier. It's not only a question of political or other pressures that are brought to bear by the providers of electricity, or of oil, or of coal, or natural gas or diesel to help power the power plants in some of these poor countries. It's also an economic dependence, and it's a dependence, of course, on the fluctuations of the market. And there's other reasons and other important elements of bringing solar to Africa that I don't have to go into here in detail, but it makes a big difference. The fact that solar is a relatively low maintenance. You have a different kind of a power plant with a solar field than you do with an oil burning or natural gas burning power plant. And these are very, very important issues for these developing economies. And the same can be true about what it is that we're trying to do in terms of the balance. Solar during the day and perhaps oil or diesel or natural gas during the evening. We're actually building our first hybrid power plant, which is a wind generating field at night in Zambia and a solar field during the day, where when the solar energy is follows an upside down bell curve, of course, with the rise of the sun and then setting of the sun. And just as the sun sets, the wind comes up in this coastal region in Zambia and then provides all night energy production. That's the kind of thing that we're working on as a company. And the general issue relates to how to create what's called load balance on the national grid. And there are other issues that I won't go into in terms of helping to improve the grids in these countries. Now, one of the issues that you might be interested in hearing a bit about also is something that we're not so familiar with in the Western world. And when we went to build the field in Rwanda, just for instance, Gigawatt Global had to help the Rwandan government to write the regulations that they could put into place in order to allow an independent power producer to feed power into the national grid. And they were the first in Sub-Saharan Africa to do so. In fact, we at Gigawatt Global, I'm proud to say, have a wonderful relationship with the not only national governments in Africa, but European and international institutions, where we have helped to contribute to the creation of many of those regulations across the region. And in fact, the American USAID, the development agency of the United States government, and their Power Africa program, which was initiated by the Obama administration and has been continued by the Trump administration, with its focus on helping African nations to increase their electricity generating capacity, and particularly through renewable energy. The Power Africa team actually called on Gigawatt Global and our legal team to help create a handbook to write these sorts of regulations. But that's kind of an unusual place to start. Usually when you think of building a power plant, those mechanisms, the structures, the infrastructure exists already in terms of the legal framework. But that's one of the challenges that companies and governments face in bringing electricity to Africa. Another is the question I mentioned just now about grid capacity. The grids are relatively undeveloped in African nations, in most of Sub-Saharan Africa. And so we've had to help, and USAID and German and Japanese and British and French government development organizations have helped to create that infrastructure, enabling independent companies like ours to come in and build the kind of power plants that we've been talking about. Now, land becomes a really interesting issue. I want to tell you a bit of a story. This, by the way, on the right is Hannah, who I mentioned earlier, is our PhD in solar energy, who's the head of our engineering and project management. Land issues are very, very challenging in some of the countries in Africa that we're dealing with. I want to tell you a story. I'm just closing down the screens here there for a minute so I can come back to you a little bit more personally. I'll tell you a story about the situation we had in one country where the discussion about compensation for land was proceeding very, very successfully, and about 300 families who were being relocated, of course, with their agreement and with compensation, and not relocated far from their land, but to make room for the large field that we're building. And of course, in conjunction with the local and regional national authorities. At one point, a group of women came to Hannah to make a request. And the request was that the payment of this compensation, which is an ongoing payment, not just a one-time payment, not be made to the male heads of households of the region, which was the original intent and understanding, which was made with the tribal leaders, with the concurrence of the national government. It turns out that rather than using these payments to bring benefits to their families, their children, their wives, what have you, the intention of many of the men in this village was to purchase another wife, to have a second wife and family. And this became a problem because it's not really our place, not as Americans or Israelis or Westerners, to impose our social standards on another culture. But on the other hand, within the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, whether it's women's empowerment or benefits for children, food security or otherwise, and within the context of our own moral integrity or the values that we try to bring to our projects, we didn't feel 100% comfortable with this arrangement when we discovered it. So we had the opportunity to have long discussions, negotiations, conversations with local tribal leaders, male predominantly, with the national and the regional and the local authorities. And we managed to come to a reasonable agreement to ensure that the resources that were going to be shared with the local communities related to the land issues, and it's a wider cultural issue, not just, of course, related to the land, but you can see why I'm connecting and sharing this anecdote with you. We managed to successfully come to an agreement that enables these families to be supported and to be compensated and to benefit from the building of the solar field without necessarily leading to the kind of a scenario that was then being described. So the reason I wanted to share this with you is I didn't want this to be just a dry discussion of the facts and the figures. I wanted you to understand some of the more kind of maybe interesting or intricate details of doing business in these sort of developing countries. And that's just one example. Specifically about land, we can talk about the fact that, unlike in Western countries, where there is a relatively well-established and principled and legal foundation for land ownership, in many less developed nations, there are more traditional understandings, both including ancestral homelands which have spiritual significance, and the issue of private ownership not being quite as clear, that if a family works a certain parcel of land and they have a certain right or claim to it, even if they don't or never had any real legal title to the land. And issues like that become part and parcel of our everyday doing business. It's that kind of thing that has led us as a company to gain the kind of experience that we have, that has enabled us to be successful, not just in Rwanda, and now we're building in Burundi, but beyond that as well. And of course, to be successful in these kind of backs and forth with the local community. Now, I mentioned earlier our commitment to social and humanitarian goals. And one of them is not just the general economic opportunity that's provided by a greater electricity generating capacity in terms of the economic possibilities that it creates for new factories, even for small home businesses to develop. Things like sewing machines being run by solar electricity, enabling a family to have a bit of extra income. Grinders for corn or wheat or barley or other crops, which are more accessible, and you don't have to walk 4 hours in each direction to find a grinder in a neighboring village in order to grind the harvest from that particular week. Not to mention the fact that most of the grinders in use, most of the small mills for grinding wheat and other barley and soy and the like, are diesel, old diesel small machines, which are not only expensive to run and break down and very inefficient, but often are also in the hut of the family that owns it, meaning it's even more not just an environmental hazard in terms of the pollution, but it is a real health hazard to the family, just as those cooking stoves that I mentioned earlier. So a solar powered grinder is not only more efficient and cleaner, but also it can be used locally, which saves time, and of course then creates not just the economic benefit of to the family running the grinder for their own produce, but they can use that for others and charge others a small fee to grind their produce. And then, of course, with the added income that they get from the efficiencies that are provided, they can buy clothes or food, medical supplies, which of course then have a trickle down impact on the rest of the economy in their village or the surrounding area. But also, and that's what this slide depicts, we make as a principle, we made a decision in the very, very beginning to use as many local employees and contractors as possible. And we actually provide technology training, both at the construction stage for the construction of the field and for the maintenance, the operation and maintenance of the field, which means two things. There is local employment from the outset, which obviously provides economic impact and economic support for the local community. It also, as is indicated here, has a trickle-down effect because there are different services that need to be provided. There's food, there's other services that need to be provided, which also benefits the local community. But those who are trained by us in the construction of the operations and the maintenance of these fields, solar panels or whatever, can then go, obviously are developing a marketable skill that they can go on and use, whether it's with Gigawatt Global or with other companies or development organizations going further down the line in terms of their life and building a career and having a marketable skill. But there's more than that also. There's when you build a renewable energy field in Africa, I mentioned, for instance, that the distribution difficulties of bringing coal or oil to a plant that would be power producing is difficult because there's this 8-hour bumpy ride in a Jeep up to where our solar field is. There is really no infrastructure across wide swaths of Sub-Saharan Africa. Roads, I'm talking about. And that being the case, that means that if we have to build a road, as we're doing in Burundi, to bring our solar panels or the construction machinery to the solar field we're building, then that also means that that road will be there to serve the population of that country for all sorts of other uses, of course. It's true also in terms of the use both of the electricity to extract water from wells, but also because we would build a well to provide water for the construction team that's building the field and the operation and maintenance afterwards. That water will be available to the local community. But now I want to go one step further, because the issue of the impact on the local community is one which can't be overestimated. We call it, and companies in our field and many, many companies today in America and elsewhere call it corporate social responsibility. The impact that you have as a company on the local community is important across the globe, but most particularly in these developing nations. So the anecdote I just told about the impact, economic impact on families and how they choose to use those resources that they get as a benefit, that clearly smacks of the issues of social responsibility, but it goes much further. In one of our fields, we'll be providing solar panels to help provide electricity for a local school. In another, well, in Burundi, we provided solar lighting for the main marketplace in their capital city of Bujumbura. Now, I use the term capital city appropriately. It is their capital, but you can't really think of Washington, D.C. or Paris when you think of Bujumbura. Burundi, as I think I mentioned, is one of the 3 poorest nations on the planet. Their capital city has no paved roads and no electricity for most of its residents. There is some, but that's primarily for factories and industrial regions and government offices. So as a gesture to the governor and the president of the country, as we began to work in Burundi, we installed a solar-powered set of streetlights in their main marketplace. The purpose of which, as requested by the local authorities, was to extend the market trading day after dark. Now that itself was for us a gesture of corporate social responsibility. But what we didn't expect, what was reported to us just a few weeks after their installation, shows what kind of impact a business like ours has, even sometimes without knowing it. We were told two things, which this was now a number of months ago, and we were just told recently that these trends continued. We were told two things, two impacts of these street lighting installations. One was that there was a significant reduction in traffic accidents. And by the way, when I say traffic accidents, I'm talking about pedestrians being run down by ox carts, as well as by jeeps or trucks delivering produce. Very few private cars in this region, in Burundi. But a very significant reduction of traffic accidents because most of the traffic, pedestrian, bicycle, and also vehicular, as well as ox carts and the like, didn't see each other as people closed down their stalls and crossed the road. More significantly for us, because one of our main focuses within the context of our understanding of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is women's empowerment. Now, in Africa and other developing nations, most of us in America or the developed world don't really aren't really aware, perhaps, of this kind of a situation. But women are really at risk in many of these more agrarian economies. For instance, women may walk 2 to 4 hours in each direction to get water from a watering hole or a well and walk back in the dark. Young girls or women carrying water on their shoulders or on their head. And unfortunately, there is a significant amount of harassment that they have to endure. And that was true in this marketplace as well, that after dark, the women who often are the ones going to the marketplace either to sell or to buy produce that is produced by individual family units. There was a lot of harassment of women in the marketplace. And I think it's important for us as Westerners to understand, even if there's a different cultural milieu that allows perhaps a bit more harassment of women, there still is a threshold beyond which even a society like Burundi's would prefer to see not being so much part of their culture and society. And what was reported to us by the mayor of Bujumbura is that after these streetlights were installed, the incidence of harassment of women was reduced precipitously. And that, of course, was gratifying because that was not the original intent, but it was very, very good and nice for us to know that that element of, call it personal security or safety, not just traffic safety, but individual safety, was impacted by the streetlights that we put in there. Now, I mentioned before the issue of taking water from the ground. There's issues of waste management, and the education issues, of course, of being able to have schools continue even into hours of darkness. There's no question that providing energy, electricity, and particularly renewable electricity, has a real impact on people's lives, which is why we're so dedicated to the work that we do. Now, the other aspect that I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to turn off the screen so that well, it's not a question of distraction. If you look at this field on the screen, that's an actual picture of our field at the Agozu Sholom Youth Village in Rwanda. And I'd like now to take a few minutes to share with you the story of that youth village, because it's also part of what I would call our DNA, of our company, and also a good example of the kind of business culture that we're trying to foment in Africa and beyond. Now, I mentioned the Gigawatt Global as a company operates out of Jerusalem. I think I mentioned that, but we're a Dutch company that is headquartered in Jerusalem. And I did mention that it was founded by my friend Yosef Abramowitz a number of years ago after he had initiated the solar industry in Israel. And he and his team were asked by a number of African leaders to do the same in their countries. And Rwanda became the first nation and the first market that Gigawatt Global entered, with the blessing and the encouragement and the support of the president of Rwanda, who actually made our project a national priority project. But the story is much more interesting than just the business aspects of building a solar field in Rwanda. The story really starts with an American philanthropist, a Jewish woman from Washington, D.C., or that area, named Anne Heyman, who went to Rwanda after the genocide in Rwanda and was struck by the difficulties the country, very poor country, was having to try and move beyond the horrors of the genocide, the civil war, or really appropriate term is massacre by the Hutus of the Tutsis there in Rwanda. Now, as a bit of background, after the Holocaust, the Shoah, as it's called in Hebrew, after the Holocaust, the Jewish community in Israel and in pre-state Israel, in the areas of what became Israel in 1948, 49, starting back in 1945, 46, recognized that they had a real challenge. There were thousands of orphans that were survivors of the Holocaust between the ages of 1, 2 years old or younger, up to age 18, who, of course, were what we call today suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they really didn't have a name for it, just shock and tremendous suffering, and were brought to Israel, and there was a real need to absorb them into Israeli society. And that was a significant challenge. Language barriers to learn Hebrew, learning a trade, a skill that they could use to support families in the future, hopefully, and obviously needing the emotional and psychological support that anyone who went through that sort of a tremendously difficult experience would need, but these kids had no families. So the community in pre-state Israel and in the beginning, the years of Israel, created what were called youth villages in Aliyat Noar, or Kfarei Noar in Hebrew. And these youth villages, based on a kibbutz model of kind of a communal living environment, were very successful in rehabilitating and acculturating these orphans from the Holocaust. And so Anne Heyman, who was aware of this as a supporter, as a Jewish philanthropist, supporter of Israel and supporter of some of these youth villages, when she saw the difficulties that the Rwandan authorities were having with the thousands of orphans that they had from their genocide, suggested perhaps taking a leaf out of the Israeli experience. And she went beyond that. She didn't just help to fund, but she brought experts, psychologists, sociologists, educators, community planners from Israel to help the Rwandan authorities, and they built what they ended up naming the Agozo Shalom Youth Village. The Agozo Shalom Youth Village, Agozo is the region that it's in, and Shalom is the Hebrew word, as you may know, for peace. And that itself expressed a connection between the Jewish people and Israel and the Rwandan youth village being created. Now that youth village had very, very good land available in a region of the country where the solar radiation was just the best according to our surveys. And what happened was Anne Heyman made a connection. She unfortunately passed away just before the dedication of the field, but she made the connection between Gigawatt Global and its Israeli leadership, Yosef and Chaim Motzen and others, and the Rwandan authorities, which led to Gigawatt Global leasing the land for this field that you can see now again on your screen from the youth village. And that youth village therefore benefits from the recurring revenue from that land lease for at least the 30 years that were signed as an agreement for the duration of the power purchase agreement between Gigawatt and the Rwandan authorities, and probably well beyond that, 40, 50 years with the replacements of panels and the improvement of the technology that we've seen already just in the last 5 years. The income from those, from that lease, from the income from this field provides the budget for their medical facilities, for the medical clinic, for the youth village. And that medical clinic serves also the surrounding community. So it's another more personal example, more specific and individual example, rather than talking in generalities, that I hope that you'll agree is somewhat uplifting and plays an important role in our dedication to the business that we're running, that yes is a for-profit business, but that is meant to have a real impact on the local community, the region, the country, and the entire continent that we're working in. A few more words about Gigawatt itself, just before we close. We're creating this platform which is building these renewable energy fields across the continent with the goal to become an independent renewable energy platform where we actually don't just return an investment to our investors from individual projects, but we actually manage those projects. And in doing so, we can impact on those United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that you saw earlier and that I described in at least mentioning the women's empowerment issues, and they include combating climate change and promoting both social and economic development in these very, very difficult and poor regions, and providing the kind of food security that we were also talking about, as well as personal security. Now, we've built, I mentioned the first fields in Israel. You can see one here on the right in Kibbutz Ketorah, which is a 40 megawatt field, which helps to provide that 100% of the power I mentioned in the south of Israel during the day already. Just recently, we made that announcement, I think in March, that we achieved that goal, a goal that hopefully, as I said, the rest of the world can also set for itself, and all of Israel, I think, will in the coming years. We also built a field actually in Georgia, the state of Georgia in the United States, an opportunity that we pursued and learned some very interesting lessons from, another 40 megawatt field, but we actually sold our interest in that field because having built it and learned those lessons, we continued to focus on Africa. And here you can see the field on the left at the Agozo Shalom Youth Village in Rwanda, which you might notice is an unusual shape. It's actually shaped, you might remember from the first screen where you saw the first photo of it, it's shaped in the shape of Africa, a very symbolic statement about African turning to renewable energy across the continent. You can see actually in the background the Agozo Shalom Youth Village, the village itself and its school, which of course plays an important role in our discussions of who we are as a company. Now, we're going to talk at the next session about Israel's relationship with Africa and African nations. And just as a teaser, I will tell you that we're going to go back as far as King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and talk about over the years, over the centuries, over eons, millennia, the very interesting ups and downs of relationships between the people of Israel and the country of Israel today with different African nations. But our company has an unusual connection also between Israel and Africa. And you can see that expressed here in this kind of graph or picture on the right, where you can see three concentric circles, and those concentric circles have at their center our company, Gigawatt Global. And just briefly, I'll explain that the top circle is the United Nations and the international community and the European Union and others that have the goals of promoting renewable energy, climate change, combating climate change, food security, and the like, that we play a very central role in terms of the markets that we're in Africa. On the bottom right, you see Power Africa, the American flag, which is representing America's focus on and contribution to and promotion of these same goals of combating climate change and promoting economic and social development in Africa and other developing nations. And on the left, the lower circle, is Israel and the Jewish people and their diplomatic and humanitarian goals. All of this coalesce in a unique nexus with Gigawatt Global because we are actually a Dutch registered company. So we are part of the EU, we are part of founding members, I mentioned of Power Africa, but also of a number of different initiatives in Europe. And so we are very much part of that international community focused on these objectives of promoting economic development and the like in Africa. We also, though, are very connected to America, both as I mentioned, as a founding partner of the Power Africa initiative of USAID, also because most of our investors are Americans, either individuals or companies or foundations or impact investment funds. Most of our investors are American, and from an American perspective, that makes us virtually an American company. And yet our headquarters are in Jerusalem, and most of our employees are Israeli. We also have Arab Palestinian employees. We also have employees that are Burundi, and we have both employees and contractors and partners and associates who are in a number of our other markets around Africa. But our headquarters are in Jerusalem. Most of our staff are Israeli, and so we embody in ourselves an Israeli ethos, as it were, even though we're officially a Dutch company. And in fact, we work very closely with the foreign ministry of the State of Israel to promote Israel-Africa relations. And again, I'll speak more about that in our follow-up discussion in another few weeks. But we're very much aware of and connected to our Israeli identity, even though we're also, for the record, very connected as a European company. We work with the ambassadors and economic attaches and the foreign ministries of not just the Netherlands, but of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, France. In fact, the funders of our projects in Rwanda and Burundi and other projects are European development financial institutions. Norfund, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, was one of our financial partners in Rwanda, as was the Dutch Development Bank, FMO, and they are also backing our Burundi project. Global, which is a private initiative of the British government to promote investment in these kind of infrastructure projects, is a partner in one of our projects, as is the French government. So we're at this unique nexus, and we are bringing all these pieces together to build these kind of renewable energy projects across Africa. Here you can see how active we are in Ethiopia, in Zambia, as well as in South Sudan, one of the other. If I said Burundi is one of the poorest nations on the planet, and it's virtually a dysfunctional country, well, the same could be said of South Sudan, so much so that the United States, the USAID program, pulled out of South Sudan for about 3 years while we were still there. We have license number 001 from the Energy Ministry of the newly created state of South Sudan, and we never left. We're active in Nigeria, in Liberia, in West Africa, also in Guinea and Conakry. We're also active in Kenya and another half a dozen nations across the region. What we are doing, quite literally, is creating a revolution in the economies and the social and cultural fabric of these developing nations in Africa, and we're very proud of that. We call it, as you can see here, doing well by doing good. It's okay to make a profit and have a business model that makes a profit for our investors, while we also enable the development of these the promotion of these other very important goals for these poor societies. On the left of this picture, by the way, you can see Yosef Abramowitz, my friend of almost 20 years, and the head of the Aryeh Power Company, which is where you see him pictured here, and also the head of Gigawatt Global and our projects in Africa. And here he's standing with somebody whose face you might recognize, the former president of Israel, Shimon Peres, also a former foreign minister, defense minister, and prime minister of Israel, when Mr. Peres came to visit the Keturah field in support of the renewable energy that we were actively pursuing there in Israel, and also, of course, in Africa. Now, this is a face that you may not recognize, but I guarantee you your children or your grandchildren will recognize. Bono, the name of the gentleman on the left, is the lead singer of a band called U2, which you also may be familiar with, you may not be familiar with, but he came to the dedication of our field in Rwanda. There you see him with Yosef at the field in Rwanda at the Agozos Shalom Youth Village. at the dedication of that field, where in addition to thanking the US government, USAID, the American ambassador was there and spoke, and the Dutch government and their development bank, we basically raised a challenge to the international community to help us do more of these projects to bring this kind of renewable energy to Africa. And I think that's where we can close. I hope that you've enjoyed this kind of overview of the importance of and the possibility of bringing renewable energy to Africa, why it's advantageous for the African nations, why it can be profitable, why it can help with the development, social and economic development of these societies. And it's what's true for Sub-Saharan Africa is true for the developing nations of South America and Asia and others. And we certainly have a vision to help bring sustainable renewable energy to the poorest people and the poorest nations on the planet over the next decade. Thank you for joining me. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon, this time going a little bit deeper into the historical and social and cultural and religious and other aspects of the centuries old or even millennia old relationship between Israel and Africa. That will be our discussion for next time. Thanks again. I hope you've enjoyed. And if you have any questions or you have any interest in learning more about our work in renewable energy in Africa, please feel free to email me at Aryeh, A-R-Y-E-H, .green @gmail.com, or Aryeh, A-R-Y-E-H, @gigawattglobal.com. And I can't put onto the screen the URL, the internet address of the video that I mentioned earlier. But if you go to our website, gigawattglobal.com, or if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you a link to that video, or you can see it on our website, gigawattglobal.com. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing you again soon.